This is really an important area because I really, everywhere I go now, whenever I do these kinds of workshops, the first question that comes up is, what about municipal bonds? What's going on with municipal bonds? The name says it all. Treasury, any security issued by the United States Treasury, any security issued by a corporation, if they issue bonds, you earn the interest and you have to pay taxes on that. There is a provision of the law that allows for cities, states, counties, municipal agencies to issue municipal bonds, and the advantage of that is that the interest you earn on those bonds, in most cases, is free of any taxation. So that's hence the term tax-free municipal bonds. They're very popular, especially in a state like California, which has such a high state income tax. You combine that with the federal income tax, and you're pretty much in a tax bracket over 50%. So whatever you can do to avoid having to pay state and federal income taxes for people in the middle to higher income tax brackets makes an awful lot of sense. With that said, I don't know if you've been keeping up with current events or not, but California is having a little financial trouble right now. And would you want to be investing your money into bonds that are issued by the state or a troubled municipality in the state and run the risk of those bonds defaulting or you not being paid your interest or principal back? This comes up all the time. And I always like to point out that historically the default rate on municipal bonds in California and across the nation for that matter is less than 1/4%. It's historically run about 0.18, about an eighth of a percent of all municipal bonds default are missed payments. So it's a very, very low risk environment. So it's something to be aware of, but it's not something that should dissuade you from investing in bonds. In California, we had a revolution in this state, as you may remember, back in the 1970s when the taxpayers revolted and passed something called Prop 13 because of the way that the governments were working. They were gouging people with the higher property taxes, forcing a lot of people on fixed incomes to have to sell their houses because they couldn't afford to pay the property taxes. So a terrible, awful piece of legislation called Prop 13 was passed. It's terrible because it was not a good piece of law, but the legislature in the state wasn't willing to do anything, so you wind up with what you get when the people get flat out mad and aren't going to put up with it anymore, and that's what we saw. There are two types of bonds that are issued by municipal governments. One are called general obligation bonds. That simply means they are backed by the taxing power of the entity, the state or the city that issues those bonds. And that's where there might be some concern, although in California, the Constitution of the state reads that revenues derived through taxes, the first priority for those taxes is to go to pay for education in the state. The second priority is to pay the debt on the bonds. So it comes in way ahead of law enforcement, fire services, or anything like that. Paying the debt is the second priority for tax dollars. So that makes it even less likely that they would default. The other type of bonds we have in California and other states are called revenue bonds. They're bonds that are tied to a unique project, and that is the source of the money to pay the interest on the bonds and to pay back the principal when they mature. I always use the classic example. The Coronado Bay Bridge was built with municipal bonds. They were issued by the government. They used that money to build the bridge, and every time you drove across the bridge and dropped your quarters into the basket, that was the money they collected to pay the interest on the bonds and then to pay back the bonds when they matured. The bridge was such a success, they paid off the bonds early. They had plenty of money. Now you don't have to pay to go across the bridge because it's free and clear. So I don't have a problem with the safety of bonds. The risk of default to me is not a concern. My concern about bonds is what happens if interest rates go up the way that many people think they will when inflation ultimately kicks in again. And when inflation goes up, interest rates go up as well. And if you buy a bond today that's yielding 3%, and a year from now the similar bond is yielding 6%, your bond is not nearly as valuable if you had to sell it than the newer bond that has come out. If you hold it to maturity, that's fine. The key to this whole thing about bonds, whether it's municipal bonds, corporate bonds, government bonds, is keep your maturity short. Don't go out to the 30-year range. There are mutual funds that are called intermediate term bond funds. And instead of owning bonds with maturities of 30 years, they hold bonds with a maturity of no more than 10 years. Most of these types of bond funds now are about in the five-year maturity range. Your income's going to be a little bit less, but you're reducing your volatility by about 80%.